The car business is rapidly changing, and modern car dealers are meeting the demand. I'm Michael Cirillo, and together we're going to explore what it takes to create a thriving dealership and life in the retail automotive industry. Join me each week for inspiring conversations with subject matter experts that are designed to help you grow. This is the Dealer Playbook. Tom Kline is the founder of Better Vantage Point, a dealership dispute, compliance, and risk mitigation company with over 30 years experience. And by the way, his family's been in the car industry owning dealerships for like almost 100 years or maybe 100 years. Like there is some history in this deal. He's on a mission to help dealers mitigate risk by getting them out of trouble and staying out of trouble. Tom, thanks so much for joining me here on the Dealer Playbook podcast.
Thanks for having me, Michael. I appreciate it.
Now, I was just telling you, I've probably done more research for this episode than perhaps any of the other episodes I've conducted because, in fact, risk mitigation is not a topic I think we've ever discussed on the show. Now, there's probably been some sort of, rhetoric in and around minimizing risk or whatnot, but not specifically about this topic. And so I guess my first question is, I saw a recent LinkedIn post of yours where you answer the question specifically, what is risk mitigation? And I loved the visual. It was like a pole. Now we're taking the listener on a journey here, but it was a pole with all these bike locks on it. And the bike locks were just like on the ground around this pole. And of course, no bikes. They were not attached to any bikes. They were not protecting any bikes. And so in your experience in the last 30 years, my question to you is this: how many dealers are even thinking about minimizing their risks? And if you had to wager a guess, how much is that perhaps costing this industry annually?
Yeah, it's a great question, Michael. I think that dealers don't focus on risk quite as much as they should. And it's really a game of what if. What are you going to do if the local news media rolls up and wants to get you on camera? How are you going to handle that? Do you have a policy? What if your parts driver has a catastrophic accident and hits a family in an SUV or a station wagon? Do you have enough coverage? And generally, I find that dealers are superior at focusing on sales and numbers and gross and absorption rate in the service department, but they kind of leave the insurance and the what ifs. They kind of just leave it out, or they rely on their insurance agent to provide enough cover. And what I've come across is the insurance agents are sometimes nervous or apprehensive about proposing products to the dealer because the perception of the dealer is, I'm covered and that's that. I did the insurance thing. My renewal's over. I don't have to think about that again for another year. Right. And an insurance policy isn't something that should sit on the shelf. It's something it's like a living, breathing document, to use that kind of analogy. And it's something that the dealer should pull off the shelf and say, okay, well, what happens if the building burns down and there's a big pile of rubble? Do we have enough coverage to get rid of the pile of rubble, as an example?
Right. Yeah. And that's very interesting to think about, because you're right. I think generally speaking, our minds around insurance, especially, is like, here you go. You go to Best Buy, they try and sell you the insurance because what if? And you go to but you've just outlined very real scenarios that are happening every single day. In fact, I remember one of your posts in which you had highlighted how the insurance policy, as a living and breathing thing, once you assessed a policy for a dealership, you had saved them something like $30,000 or something like that by simply making revisions and highlighting perhaps things they didn't need or didn't need as much of. Can you maybe walk us through that process? Because I think that's what piqued my question. I'm like, man, if he's saving one dealership $30,000 a year, or I think the exact number was 29,000 you had said.
Right.
And you multiply that by whatever, 12 to 15,000 franchise dealers. Let's forget, I mean, there's 40,000 independents in the United States alone. So let's call it 60,000 dealers. We're talking about, I'm no mathematician, but we're talking about a buttload.
It's sort of a certified buttload. Yes.
So what would you recommend dealers look at in order to perhaps assess where they can keep more money in their pockets?
Sure. So in that particular instance, I was hired by a dealer group out of Washington, D.C., and they hired me about 2 weeks before their renewal. And they said, what can you do for us? And I said, well, typically I like to start 6 months in advance, but send me your policy and let me read it. And it was 362 pages. So I read the 362 pages. As a result of the 362 pages, I came up with 107 questions that I called the agent and went over the 107 questions. Out of the 107 questions, we had 26 items that were actionable. A lot of the items on on this particular dealer's policy were like legacy items, like nobody ever checked they had, I don't know, like 70 or 80 D tags, when in reality they only had 20. And insurance companies rate you on D tags. I mean, it's things that simple. But somebody's got to go in and say, hey, do you have 70 D tags, or is that left over from a previous number, or did a previous agent just stick that on a policy and you didn't even know about it? So I had 26 actionable items. That's what saved the 29,000. And then I went back and said, okay, here are a lot of different areas that you don't have enough coverage on, that we need to bump the coverages up. A lot of coverages had only $25,000. And in my mind, there were minimums. I used the debris removal example. That's a specific thing on a policy that if your building burns down, there's a specific pocket of money in each insurance policy for debris removal.
Right.
And typically on a basic policy, it's $25,000. Well, if your building burns, you can imagine that won't even get a bulldozer out to move the stuff, much less to get rid of it. So by going through with the dealers and saying, hey, are you comfortable with this? Another example is, do you ever buy truckloads of vehicles? Because there's a certain coverage that if you buy a whole truckload of vehicles and something happens to them, are you covered? I mean, so there are all kinds of things that happen in a dealership on a daily basis that are insurable that dealers don't think about. And so those are the areas I focus. And with the 29,000 savings, we ended up spending about 8,000 of that savings trying to build up some of those other coverages.
Yeah, super interesting. It really highlights or I guess underscores the fact that as a business owner, you must think about all of these what ifs, because when one of those what ifs happens, it is very uncomfortable to learn at the 11th hour and 59th minute that you did not have what you needed. Now, I have a I guess, more specific question, because you're right. Something you had said earlier, in this industry, most of the conversation is about how to move more metal, chip shortage, I don't know, culture, employees, how do I hire, retain, all these sorts of things. As you were coming up in the dealership, I think it's fascinating because, you do have a similar story in how you started in the business to some others. But where it ends is none of them go, but this really perceived boring thing over here, I'm going to go specialize in that. They're usually like, I'm going to go run the thing. And then I, have a timeshare in Palm Desert and we play golf. What was it about? How did you tell me about how this happened? Because, you could have, I'm guessing, picked a path in the store that was the complete opposite end of risk mitigation. But what was it that led you down this path specifically while you were working at your dealership?
Good question. So I'll start with I was working in the office, and it was, as you mentioned in the introduction, it was a family business, and my family's been in the car business since 1925. So it's literally in my DNA. So I was working in the office as a controller. My brother called me in and said, I just fired the collection manager for doing coke. You're the new collection manager. So
thrown into the deep end.
You're now the collection manager. And so as the business grew, I had as many as 7 collectors and an in-house attorney working for me. And there was a lot of buy here, pay here paper. There was a lot of bounce down payment check, the regular. So what happened was the problems started bubbling to me because they were generally the result of secondary finance problems. And because I was the collection manager, I was then in charge of the bigger problem. And so I cut my teeth, if you will, on dealing with customer problems vis-a-vis the collection department. Then as the years went by, it made sense to consolidate the insurance with me, because if you're doing a good job on handling the customer problems, then you're not going to have as many insurance claims related to that. And so that part kind of moved to me. And so it ended up that the 3 different areas of risk mitigation in a dealership, and that is reputation management or dispute resolution, which are really the same. I call it reputation mitigation, is kind of a more accurate, because if you're doing that right, when the customers post that they're upset, you actually pick up the phone, call them, which this is a unique thing apparently. You pick up the phone, you call them, you get them into the store, you sit them down in front of you, you make them happy or satisfied, or the words I use. We don't want you to be upset with us. We want you to be satisfied with your purchase or your situation. Then you ask them to update their review, not change it, because if you ask them to change it, they're going to feel manipulated. They're going to feel like the only reason you're helping them is because you'll update their, to change the review. And so the dispute resolution piece grew out of the collection piece. And then I started handling all the legal affairs for the dealership. And the legal affairs are, how can we resolve these problems as quickly as possible and with as little money as possible? And when they get complicated, can we turn them over to the insurance company? What do the policies look like? Where are the holes in our policies? What else should we think about? What other policies are there in the world that we don't know about, maybe, and research? And so try to continually to patch all the chinks in the armor, if you will. And so that's kind of how all 3, when it comes to compliance, I call it 3 legs of a stool, right? You've got compliance, you've got dispute resolution, and then risk transference, which is, the insurance part of it. That's why there are 3 legs of the stool, and any one of which, if they fall over the stool or you pull out the leg, the stool falls over. So that was kind of the evolution of it.
I think this is so fascinating. One of the things you've said, and by the way, I think you might be the only other individual in my adult life. Maybe I need to get better friends, but you're the only other person I've heard who said something that my father, being raised by an entrepreneur, he's the only other person that I've heard say this. And now, of course, it's part of my vocab. He said, it's not about how much money you make, it's about how much money you keep. And you are the only other person. In fact, I was just having a conversation with my team about this, because to your earlier point, we're so focused on new sales, that we forget. Everybody's chasing this. Oh, did you hear about Uber's 1.7 billion, whatever? And did you hear about Clubhouse is now worth $4 billion. And we're like, new. I had spent earlier in my career, as I was building our company, I spent years chasing this ideal of, oh, there's all these other companies that compete with me that are bigger than me and doing, and it was shocking to me when they would go to sell how little they actually received, predicated on the fact that they had zero money in the coffers. They were barely breaking even and perhaps even wasting money. And I couldn't help but think how much of that was the direct impact of just mismanagement of what ifs. So, for example, one that we talk a lot about in the industry, in my opinion, maybe this is a stretch, but it's where my brain goes, and I'd love your take on this, is the impact of culture and employee happiness. Because I think when I look at a P&L, I see a line item for salary. What I don't see is inefficiency within salary. How happy is that employee? Have they given me grievances that I have not done anything about? Is morale low? Does it now take them 3 times longer to complete tasks? All I see is the line item for salary, but it doesn't actually give me an indication on what the actual expenditure is, how much money I'm bleeding. Are there other instances, in your experience, are there other instances that dealers need to look at that perhaps don't immediately reflect on a P&L, but that are definitely having an impact on how much money they keep?
Sure. The problems at a dealership start one of 3 ways, in my experience. It's either a customer problem, an employee problem, or an advertising problem. If you can handle those 3, you're going to get rid of 90% of the problems. So to address the employees. So employees will create problems. So absolutely, culture has a lot to do with how the company runs and the importance of keeping those employees happy. So at a minimum, Michael, they don't go to the EEOC and complain, and they don't post on Glassdoor. I ask dealers all the time, do you ever look at Glassdoor? And a lot of dealers don't know what Glassdoor is. And for the listeners, Glassdoor is a site where employees can go and complain about their employer, either during their employment or after their employment. So there's no requisite like they have to quit to post a review of the company.
Right. And
I know a lot of people who will read Glassdoor before they'll think about even interviewing with the company because they want to see what the culture is like. So I definitely think that handling your employees and treating them well, first of all, will go a long way to resolve problems. And a lot of the problems that employees have, candidly, are communication issues. They don't know where to go with a problem. And one of the things that I've done about that, just briefly, shameless plug coming here, I started a company called alwaysdobetter.com, and you'll see the sign right over here. And that is a digital comment box. So the dealer puts up signs that says, you can see right there, it says, let your voice be heard.
Right.
So that employees as well as customers can give the dealer feedback without going on Glassdoor and without going on Google and Yelp and Yahoo and all these other ones and saying that the dealer sucks and it's terrible to be there. So you want to capture that feedback from your employees in whatever way you do it and whatever's good for your culture. But it's important to actually capture the feedback so that you can try to fix the problems, because there's and I don't have statistics, but there's an untold amount of money that gets lost when you have an employee quit who's been there and knows their job, and all of a sudden you have a retraining, and that takes time. I mean, the retraining takes time. They make mistakes. Their boss has to take time to do the retraining. So employees are very key in as a part of risk mitigation.
You had said advertising. What's an example of an advertising problem that would cause a headache for a
There are so many. Let me start with a recent experience when I was shopping for an SUV for my fiance and I wrote an article about this. But I called up and I said, "Hey, I'm a former dealer. I've been in the car business for 30 years. Please don't jerk me around. Can I get this car at this payment?" That was my question. Can I get this car at this payment? Well, it turned out that the dealer had the highest level trim in the pictures, but the payment was for the lowest level trim. So the difference between those two, the delta was like $679 to $1,080 or something. I mean, it wasn't even close. And there were other problems with that particular dealer, but there are website problems where rebate stacking happens, where a dealer will show that you can get the first time buyer along with the military rebate, along with the conquest, but maybe you can't get all those together, but they still show the price netting out to be, the bottom number is net with all of those. So that's a problem. Showing payments on physical vehicles or in advertisements without the APR and the amount of down payment and the length of the term of the loan. Mm-hmm. The FTC has gotten is getting more active in terms of its enforcement. I was actually on the FTC website yesterday reading about Tate Automotive, which is now out of business, and in order to stay out of jail, the owner paid $450,000 to basically settle it with the FTC. I mean, it goes on. Advertising problems go on and on. This is the
stuff TV shows are made out of.
Right.
Yeah. So, this is interesting because your example, purchasing the vehicle for your fiance, congratulations, by the way.
Thank you.
Is something that happens all the time. In fact, I mean, there's many instances I can think of where OEM even shows the caveat being, of course, or the loophole being that in the bottom corner, they have a little thing that says this is the blah, 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 and starting at and all of that kind of stuff. But it's interesting that you bring that up because what immediately comes to my mind is what's going to happen as we all actively pursue a Carvana-esque online shopping experience. Because the first thing you said about rebate stacking, I immediately thought, well, hey, I'm a tech guy. Does my tech allow people to rebate stack, or is it intelligent enough to know, is it getting the accurate data feed from Chrome Data, who supplies the incentives, who's, got the monopoly? Can we say that? Are they supplying pure enough data? And is it going down the supply chain to website providers or tech providers who provide this? Or is it just the way things have always done, where it's like, here's the data, gets visualized on the website. Now you've got the stacking issue. Nobody's aware of it because maybe tech vendor is disconnected from dealer world compliancy, all those sorts of things. So you've really got my mind thinking. What do you see? Because it's kind of hard to ignore at this point. We're all pursuing this Carvana. Oh, there's Carvana, there's Vroom, in Canada, there's Canada Drives, Auto Trader, and they're all doing this similar thing, deliver vehicle to home, buy it online, etc. What do you see looking down the road as some of the new issues, perhaps, or evolved risk issues that dealers are going to face as we move into a remote retail environment?
Yeah, so it's amazing to me when dealers, it's one of the questions I ask when I go in and say, how many sales are happening at customers' houses? And in the States, there's a law called the Home Solicitation Act, which originally was, I think the history behind that is the vacuum cleaner salesman who would ring your doorbell, throw dirt on your carpet, and then, vacuum it up. Right. And so people would buy vacuums and they got sold vacuums for way overpriced. Right. And then the feds came in and said, we can't do this anymore.
Stop throwing dirt on people's carpets. They don't like it anymore. Yeah.
Right. But with the home solicit, and I've talked to various lawyers who disagree on this. So amongst lawyers, this is not a simple answer. But if you do, of course, that's a lawyer thing, right?
And I'm now just picturing a group of lawyers sitting there going, who really grinds our gears? Door-to-door vacuum sit. They got to be the scum of the earth. I don't know why they're from the Bronx or whatever, but
That's right.
Yeah.
But the Home Solicitation Act says that if you do any selling at someone's home, that you're required to follow the act. Now, the worst part of this is if you don't follow the act, and the act is you have to sign a piece of paper giving them 3 days to bring the car back or whatever you're buying. But if you do any negotiation or any selling at their house, then you're required, the way I read it, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a compliance guy. So the way I read it is you have to follow it. If you don't follow it, the penalties are extraordinary. The penalties are that at any time, there's no time frame built into the code. So a customer could drive a car for 4 years and then come back to the dealer and say, you didn't follow the Home Solicitation Act, and I'd like all my money back. And the way that it reads is the dealer would have to give all the money back.
Whoa.
That's the way it reads to me. So if you're doing any selling at a customer's house, and I don't know what Carvana or Vroom are doing about this, but if they're not following the Home Solicitation Act and they're listening, they can hire me, and I'm going to tell them they should follow the Home Solicitation Act, because what's the big deal? I mean, The big deal is that you have a 3-day right of rescission. Well, a lot of these companies are giving people 7 days to back out anyway, right? CarMax have I don't remember what their most recent test drive. I think you test drive for either 24 hours or 7 days. I don't remember, but this is just not a big deal. And they shy away from it because it's where compliance meets sales, and some dealers get a little upset when those two things, collide.
Mm-hmm.
But the way that things are moving, for example, that's something from a compliance perspective that's going to have to be dealt with.
Amazing. This is, I'm not going to lie, I didn't know how I was going to feel coming into such a deep, I don't know what you want to call this, academic conversation. I don't know if I'm just undermining my own intelligence or not, but this was fascinating, and I'm so glad we had this conversation. I would urge those listening that you got to think about this stuff, and you need to do something about it, more importantly. How can those listening, Tom, how can they get in touch with you to learn more?
Sure. My best way is my cell number, 757-434-7656. Or if you can't remember that, go to my website, which is bettervantagepoint.com.
Amazing. Love to have you back on, because Lord knows we're going to need it in this rapidly evolving digital sales scape, and we're going to need your best advice when the proverbial crap hits the fan, so to speak, and dealers are scrambling.
But they should call me before the crap hits the fan.
There you go. That right there. Let's underscore that. Before crap hits the fan, not after. Yeah. Maybe our egos are inflated because we've weathered the pandemic somewhat well. But this is the kind of stuff you don't want to wait on, and you certainly don't want to be behind the 8 ball. Tom, thanks so much for joining me on the Dealer Playbook podcast.
Thanks, Michael. I appreciate it.
I'm Michael Cirillo, and you've been listening to the Dealer Playbook podcast. If you haven't yet, please click the subscribe button wherever you're listening right now. Leave a rating or review and share it with a colleague. Thanks for listening.